Have you ever found yourself standing alone, wondering why the people you once trusted with your heart are no longer there when you need them most? Have you ever given everything to someone you called a friend, your time, your energy, your love, only to have them turn their back on you in your darkest hour? It's a feeling that can leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about relationships and loyalty. But what if I told you that the true nature of friendship is not what we've been led to believe? What if the very idea of forever friends is an illusion, and understanding this can set you free from the pain of disappointment and abandonment? In today's video, we're about to dive deep into one of the most profound and transformative teachings that Zen and Buddhist philosophy offer. This ancient wisdom doesn't just help us understand others, but also gives us the key to understanding ourselves and the nature of our relationships. It will help you see through the veil of attachment and bring you to a place of true peace, where betrayal, disappointment, and heartbreak no longer hold the power to disturb your inner harmony. The story you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about friendship. It's not just a tale about a man's struggle with betrayal. It's a lesson that transcends time and culture. This story will reveal the impermanence of human relationships and the often unspoken truth that we are drawn to others for reasons far deeper than we realize. But don't be alarmed. This is not a tale of bitterness or distrust. Instead, it's one of profound wisdom and freedom. As we explore the nature of human connections, you'll learn that understanding the fleeting nature of these bonds is not a cause for sadness, but a doorway to freedom. The kind of freedom that comes from within, the kind of freedom that allows you to live fully without clinging to the unreliable and temporary nature of friendships. This wisdom will help you navigate relationships with greater awareness, kindness, and, most importantly, self-reliance. So, if you've ever been hurt by someone you called a friend, if you've ever been left feeling abandoned or betrayed, then this video is for you. It's time to break free from the cycle of disappointment and start living with a deeper understanding of the impermanence of all things. Before we begin, I want to invite you to join the Zen Mind Journey community. If you find value in this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more life-changing wisdom, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your support helps this community grow, and I'd love to hear how this lesson has impacted your life. Together, we can learn and grow, embracing the teachings that lead to peace and freedom. Now, let's dive into the story that will change the way you view relationships forever. Part 1. The beginning of the journey. There once lived a man who believed that friendship was the greatest gift life could offer. To him, true friendship was the foundation of happiness, a bond that could withstand the trials of time and adversity. He gave everything he had to those he called friends, his trust, his time, his love, thinking that in return, loyalty and companionship would always be there when he needed it. This belief shaped the core of his existence. He worked tirelessly to nurture and maintain the friendships he cherished, always offering a helping hand, listening ear, or a comforting presence. He would always be the first to offer support, whether it was emotional, financial, or simply being there for a friend during difficult times. He sacrificed his own well-being and desires for the sake of his friendships. When a friend was in need, he put their interests above his own, thinking that this was the true essence of loyalty. He believed that loyalty was not just a word, but a principle that bound people together through thick and thin. To him, a friend was someone who would stick around no matter the circumstances, someone who would never leave or betray him. He thought that by giving so much of himself, he was cementing relationships that would last forever. This man, despite his unshakable belief in the permanence of friendship, was not immune to the harsh realities of life. He worked hard, not just for himself, but also to support his friends, and he believed that this was the path to lasting bonds. He thought that by giving freely, expecting nothing in return, he was building a fortress of trust and mutual respect. Every time a friend asked for help, he was ready. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question whether his efforts would be reciprocated. He simply gave. In his eyes, friendship was something sacred, a bond that, once formed, could not be broken. Yet, as time passed, life began to reveal the uncomfortable truths about human relationships. The man, who once prided himself on his ability to create lasting connections, began to notice subtle changes in his friendships. The people he had helped, the ones he had been there for through every hardship, were no longer as present in his life as they once were. When he was going through difficult times, he looked around, hoping to find the same support he had given, but found himself facing the cold silence of abandonment. This growing distance was painful and confusing. How could the people he had invested so much in just vanish when he needed them most? It was as if the very fabric of his relationships was unraveling before his eyes. He found himself betrayed, alone, and questioning the very concept of friendship that had been the foundation of his life. Why, he wondered, had these people who once called him their friend turned away when he was at his lowest? He had given so much, and in return, he had expected nothing but their loyalty and support. The man sat under the shade of a great tree, his mind heavy with these thoughts. He felt an emptiness, a void that he couldn't understand. He had given his all, yet it seemed as though his efforts had been in vain. It was then that he realized that the bonds he thought were unbreakable were, in fact, fragile, held together not by love or loyalty, but by something far more transient. His belief in the permanence of friendship began to crumble. As he sat there, lost in thought, he knew he had to seek guidance. He needed to understand why these relationships had faded when he had given everything. And so, he sought out a Zen master, someone who had spent his entire life observing the ebb and flow of human nature. The master, with his deep understanding of the impermanence of all things, would offer the man the wisdom he so desperately needed. Part 2. The Master's Wisdom. The man sat before the Zen master, his heart heavy with questions that had been haunting him for so long. His voice trembled as he asked, "Why does friendship never last? Why do people change? Why do those who call me a friend today leave me tomorrow?" The words poured out, as if he had been waiting his whole life for someone to answer these painful questions. He had given so much, yet the loyalty he once believed in had vanished, leaving him with nothing but emptiness. The Zen master, an old and wise figure, listened attentively, his expression calm and serene. He had heard many such questions before, each one a reflection of the human struggle to understand relationships and the impermanence of life. With a gentle smile, the master responded, "No one is your friend. Be careful." The man was taken aback. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what the master had just said. "What do you mean, no one is my friend?" he asked, confused. "I have given my heart, my trust, and my time to people I called friends. Are you saying that all of that was in vain?" The master nodded slowly, understanding the man's confusion. "Friendship, as you have known it, is based on an illusion. It is not an everlasting bond. It is dependent on needs. A friend is a reflection of need, and when the need ends, so does the friendship. People come to you because they seek something: comfort, support, status, or even entertainment. But once their needs are fulfilled, they leave." The man sat in stunned silence. The words the master spoke cut through him like a sharp blade. The truth of what the master was saying was undeniable. His entire life had been built on the belief that friendships were permanent, that the bonds he had created with others were unbreakable. But now, the foundation of his understanding was crumbling. His relationships, which he thought were based on genuine care, were nothing more than temporary agreements driven by mutual benefit. The master continued, "You believe that your friends remain because of love or loyalty, but those are fleeting emotions. People come into your life because they need something from you. When their needs change, or when they no longer require what you offer, they move on. It is not personal. It is simply the nature of things. Do not confuse attachment with love, for attachment is driven by selfish desires, while love transcends such needs." The man struggled to grasp the depth of the master's teachings. He had always been taught that loyalty and friendship were built on shared experiences and mutual respect. But the master's words shattered that belief, forcing him to confront the reality that many of the relationships he had cherished were not as solid as he had imagined. From a Buddhist perspective, the master's teaching spoke directly to the concept of impermanence and nikka. Everything in life, including relationships, is subject to change. Nothing lasts forever. Our attachments to people, places, and things are the root of suffering because we mistakenly believe that these things can provide us with lasting happiness. In reality, they are all temporary, constantly shifting and evolving. The man's belief in eternal friendships was rooted in the illusion of permanence, and when those friendships changed or disappeared, he was left suffering. The master's wisdom also highlighted the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, pratityasamutpada, which explains that all phenomena arise and exist due to conditions and causes. In the case of relationships, friendships arise because both parties have needs that are being met. When those needs change, the friendship dissolves. It is not that people are bad or cruel. It is simply that their relationship was based on a specific set of conditions. When those conditions change, the friendship cannot survive. As the man reflected on these teachings, he realized that his suffering stemmed from his attachment to the idea of permanent friendships. He had expected people to stay by his side because he had given them so much. But the truth was that his attachment to their presence had clouded his understanding of the true nature of relationships. The pain he felt when his friends left was a result of his expectations, not because of any wrong done to him. The master's teachings brought clarity to the man's heart. He began to understand that the illusion of everlasting friendship had led him to suffer. The relationships that he had once held so dearly were not failures. They were simply expressions of human need and desire. They were never meant to last forever, and when he accepted this, he could begin to free himself from the weight of attachment. In that moment, the man realized that true peace would come from releasing his expectations and attachments to people. The wisdom of the Zen master had shown him that it was not about rejecting relationships or isolating oneself from others. It was about seeing relationships for what they truly were: temporary, ever-changing, and dependent on need. This understanding was not meant to make him bitter or distrustful of others, but rather to help him live with awareness, free from the suffering caused by false expectations. The man left the Zen master that day with a heart full of new understanding. He had learned that friendships, like everything else in life, were impermanent. And with that realization, he was ready to live with greater awareness and peace, no longer bound by the illusion of eternal loyalty, but grounded in the wisdom of accepting the changing nature of all things. Part 3. Understanding the impermanence of relationships. The master's words struck deep, revealing a harsh truth about the nature of human relationships. The man, though struggling to fully comprehend them, began to realize that people often entered into relationships not from a place of pure love, but out of a need for something. Whether it was emotional comfort, financial support, or even the need for validation, these connections were often founded on the exchange of something that filled a void. The moment that need was no longer there, the relationship began to fade. The man understood this intellectually, but it took time for him to truly accept it emotionally. This revelation didn't come easily to him. He had always believed in the idea of unconditional support, that friendships could transcend the ups and downs of life. He thought that the bonds he shared with others were based on mutual trust and love, that these connections would stand the test of time. Yet, as he reflected on his past, he saw the pattern: the friends who had come into his life when they were in need of something, and the same friends who had disappeared when their circumstances changed or their needs were met. The man's life had been a series of such relationships, temporary, dependent, and impermanent. His understanding of friendship was based on the false assumption that people would remain in his life, no matter the situation. But when his own life shifted and he found himself in need, those who had once relied on him disappeared. This painful experience left him with a sense of betrayal, but it also forced him to face a deeper truth about the way relationships work. It wasn't that his friends were malicious or unkind. Rather, they had never truly been in his life for the reasons he had believed. Over time, the man realized that he had been holding on to an illusion. He had invested so much of himself into these relationships, believing that they would be everlasting, that he hadn't considered the reality that people's needs change, and so do their relationships. This was not a reflection of his worth or a judgment on the quality of his character. It was simply the nature of human connections. Relationships are built on the conditions and needs of the present, and when those conditions change, the connection often fades. This realization was deeply unsettling at first. It made him question the sincerity of all his past relationships, leaving him feeling disillusioned and uncertain. However, as he spent more time reflecting on the master's teachings, he began to understand that this understanding of impermanence was not meant to make him bitter or distrustful of others. Rather, it was a call to wisdom, a reminder that the true nature of relationships is fleeting, and that holding on to them too tightly only causes unnecessary suffering. From the perspective of Buddhist philosophy, the concept of impermanence, anicca, is central to understanding the nature of existence. According to Buddhist teachings, everything in life, whether it be material possessions, emotions, or relationships, is in a constant state of flux. Nothing lasts forever, and this is the fundamental truth of our existence. We may become attached to things or people, thinking that they will bring us lasting happiness, but the reality is that all things change. People, too, change. Their needs, desires, and circumstances evolve, and as they do, so do the relationships they maintain. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence remind us that attachment to the temporary is the root cause of suffering. We tend to cling to people and things, believing that they will provide us with stability and happiness. But when these attachments are challenged or broken, we experience pain. This is why the Buddha taught that true peace comes from letting go of these attachments and accepting the impermanent nature of life. For the man, this was a difficult lesson, but one that would ultimately lead him to greater peace. As he began to accept the impermanence of relationships, he started to detach from the need for them to be permanent. This did not mean he stopped caring about people or stopped forming connections. Instead, he learned to engage with others without expecting them to stay forever. He could love and care for those around him, but he no longer depended on their presence for his happiness or peace of mind. This shift in perspective allowed him to live more fully in the present, appreciating the people and experiences he had in his life without clinging to them or fearing their eventual departure. He understood that the transient nature of relationships was not something to be feared, but embraced as part of the natural flow of life. In this acceptance, he found a profound sense of freedom from the suffering caused by attachment, and freedom to experience relationships as they were meant to be, temporary, fluid, and ever-changing. Through this process, the man came to understand that relationships, like all things, are impermanent. He no longer expected them to last forever, but instead, he welcomed the beauty of the present moment and the connections that existed within it. And in doing so, he found a deeper sense of peace and understanding that had eluded him for so long. Part 4. The Bitter Realization. As time passed, the man's life took a sudden turn. A business venture he had heavily invested in collapsed, leading him into financial turmoil. The same person who had once been the pillar of strength, the one everyone turned to for advice, support, and solutions, was now facing an overwhelming burden of debt. He found himself at a crossroads, needing help more than ever before. But the support he had always given to others was no longer reciprocated. The friends who had once leaned on him now seemed distant, unavailable, and preoccupied with their own lives. He thought back to the many times he had offered a helping hand, whether it was financial support or just being there for someone in their time of need. Surely, he reasoned, his friends would return the favor now. After all, hadn't they all promised that they would always have his back, no matter what? But as he reached out, one by one, his friends distanced themselves. They offered excuses. "I'm going through a tough time too," or "I really can't spare any help right now." It wasn't that they outright rejected him. It was more subtle, more painful. He was simply ignored, forgotten, left to deal with his problems alone. The man didn't feel anger toward his friends, nor did he beg them for help. Instead, he watched quietly, feeling a deep sense of confusion and growing sadness. How could the bonds that he had worked so hard to build, relationships that he had believed were rooted in mutual trust and loyalty, fall apart so easily? Why, in his time of hardship, did his friends vanish? It was in these moments of isolation that the man began to reflect on the nature of his friendships and what he had come to expect from them. He remembered the wise words of the Zen master: "A friend is a reflection of need. When the need ends, so does the friendship." The man's heart sank as he began to understand the depth of the master's teachings. His friends had not abandoned him out of hatred or malice, but because the needs that once brought them together had shifted. In his case, when he was no longer able to offer the support, resources, or status that his friends had previously relied on, they slowly moved away. Their attachment to him was not based on the strength of their emotional connection, but on the need he fulfilled for them in their lives. This realization was bitter, and it cut deep. He felt betrayed, not by their actions, but by the truth that now seemed so clear. His relationships, like so many others, had been based on temporary needs, not true, enduring connections. The sense of loyalty and trust he had once believed in was an illusion, and he had been living under the false assumption that friendship was an unbreakable bond that could withstand any hardship. But amidst the pain, there was also a sense of liberation. The man began to understand that he had been placing his trust and expectations in the wrong things. He had expected that his friendships would remain constant, no matter the circumstances. Yet, The nature of human relationships, as the master had taught, was impermanent. People come and go based on their needs, and when those needs change, so do the relationships. This was not something to feel bitter about, but rather to accept and learn from. The man's understanding of impermanence and Nikka and Buddhist teachings began to deepen. In Buddhism, all things are transient, and this includes human relationships. The attachment to people or things, believing that they will provide permanent happiness or security, is the root of suffering. By expecting permanence from relationships that are fundamentally temporary, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment and hurt. The man had placed his happiness and sense of security in the stability of his friendships, but now he realized that the true source of peace came from within, not from others. This understanding led him to change the way he approached relationships. He began to let go of his unrealistic expectations and to see people for who they truly were, individuals with their own needs and desires, constantly changing and evolving. He stopped relying on others to fill the emotional voids in his life, and instead, he began to focus on his own inner peace and self-reliance. He understood that relationships based on need were fleeting, and that the key to happiness was to let go of attachment to people, places, and things. Through this shift in perspective, the man found a sense of freedom. He could still love and care for those around him, but he no longer held on to the illusion that they would always be there, or that they owed him anything in return. He accepted the impermanence of relationships, and with that acceptance came peace. The pain of betrayal and abandonment began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of the transient nature of life itself. This realization was not about rejecting others or becoming isolated. Rather, it was about living with awareness and without attachment. It was about being present in each moment, appreciating the connections he had, but knowing that nothing lasts forever. In embracing the impermanence of relationships, the man was finally able to free himself from the cycle of disappointment and find true peace within himself. Part 5. Learning to let go of expectations. After experiencing the pain of betrayal and reflecting deeply on the impermanence of relationships, the man's perspective on life and connections began to shift. Rebuilding his life from the ground up after his financial and emotional downfall had been challenging, but it also gave him the clarity he needed to see things differently. The lesson he had learned was harsh, yet liberating. True happiness couldn't be found by relying on others or expecting permanence in relationships. He had to stop looking outside of himself for validation or fulfillment. This realization didn't come all at once. It took time for him to fully absorb the truth that others could not be his source of happiness. In the past, he had always placed his emotional well-being in the hands of those he called friends or loved ones. He believed that through their approval, affection, and support, he could feel secure and content. However, after his experience of abandonment, he realized that this was a fragile foundation. People come and go, their needs and desires change, and with it, so do relationships. If he continued to rely on others to fill the emptiness inside him, he would be left vulnerable to suffering every time someone left or failed to meet his expectations. As he worked through this understanding, the man began to take a new approach to relationships. He no longer sought out friendships or connections with the expectation of something in return. He stopped measuring the value of his interactions based on whether or not his friends would offer help or loyalty when he needed it. Instead, he learned to engage with others simply for the joy of the interaction, without any strings attached. When he helped someone, he did so because it was in his nature to be kind, not because he expected to receive anything back. If someone needed a listening ear or assistance, he would offer it freely, without anticipating a favor in return. His focus shifted from seeking external validation to cultivating a sense of inner peace that didn't depend on the actions of others. This shift in mindset wasn't easy at first. The man had spent so much of his life trying to please others and make sure that he was a dependable friend, always ready to be there in times of need. Letting go of the expectation that his kindness would be reciprocated felt unnatural. He found himself occasionally questioning whether it was right to offer help or to care for others without expecting something in return. But as time went on, he realized that when he acted from a place of genuine compassion, without the burden of expectation, the act itself became its own reward. His relationships became lighter, freer, and less prone to the weight of disappointment. Over time, this new approach began to bring the man a sense of peace he had never known. The more he let go of his expectations, the less he found himself feeling hurt or abandoned when people moved in and out of his life. He stopped measuring his worth by the presence or absence of others, and he stopped believing that his happiness depended on whether someone was there to validate him. The freedom came from within. He discovered that by relying on his own inner strength and peace, he could weather the ups and downs of life without feeling crushed by them. The reason why this change led to peace and freedom in his mind was because he no longer allowed external circumstances or the actions of others to determine his emotional state. He understood that happiness is not a commodity that can be given or taken away by other people. It is something that must come from within. When he stopped expecting people to meet his needs or provide him with the emotional support he thought he deserved, he freed himself from the cycle of disappointment. No longer did he feel betrayed when someone didn't return his kindness, or abandoned when a friendship faded away. He simply accepted that relationships are transient, like everything else in life, and that nothing, including the people around him, can be relied upon for lasting happiness. This newfound peace was also reflected in his relationships. Because he no longer expected anything from others, he was able to offer love and support without the underlying tension of "what's in it for me?" His friendships and connections became more genuine, based on mutual respect and enjoyment of each other's company rather than on the fulfillment of needs or desires. He could love deeply and care for those around him, but his happiness was no longer tied to whether or not those relationships remained permanent. He had learned that true peace comes not from external circumstances, but from the ability to accept things as they are and not be disturbed when they change. In the end, the man discovered that by letting go of expectations, he was able to experience life more fully, with greater joy and a deep sense of inner peace. He no longer relied on others to complete him or make him happy, and in doing so, he found the freedom he had been seeking all along. His relationships flourished in a way they never had before because they were no longer weighed down by the burden of expectation. He learned that the key to peace and happiness lies in accepting the impermanence of all things, including relationships, and embracing them without attachment. Part 6. The True Meaning of Friendship. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light across the landscape, a young seeker approached the man. His eyes were filled with curiosity and a longing for deeper understanding. He had heard the stories of the man's wisdom and the lessons he had learned over the years, and now he sought answers to a question that had troubled him for a long time. "What is the greatest lesson you have learned about people?" the seeker asked, his voice earnest and sincere. The man, sitting in quiet contemplation, smiled gently as he looked into the young seeker's eyes. He could see the eagerness for knowledge, the desire to understand the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of human relationships. With a calm and measured voice, the man replied, "No one is your friend. Be careful." The seeker was taken aback. His face expressed shock, confusion, and disbelief. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you saying I shouldn't trust anyone? Should I walk through life in fear, never opening my heart to others?" The man shook his head slowly, his expression serene. "No, not at all," he said. "You should be kind, be compassionate, but you must also be wise. People are not bad. They are just temporary. If you understand this, you will never suffer because of them." The seeker sat down beside the man, trying to absorb the weight of the words that had just been spoken. He had always believed that true friendship was something to be cherished, something that could provide stability and support throughout life. To him, a friend was someone who would stand by him through thick and thin, someone whose loyalty and love would never waver. The idea that friendship was merely temporary, subject to change, felt unsettling. The man, sensing the young seeker's confusion, began to explain further. "In the past, I too believed that friendships were everlasting. I thought that loyalty, trust, and love would bind people together forever. But as I grew older, I came to understand that relationships, even the closest ones, are built on the needs and circumstances of the moment. When those needs change, so do the relationships. People come and go, and that is simply the nature of life." The seeker listened intently, absorbing the man's words. The idea of impermanence, of the transitory nature of human connections, began to take root in his heart. "So, are you saying that even the people we love the most could leave us one day?" just because their needs change?" he asked. "Yes," the man replied. "But this is not a cause for bitterness or resentment. It is the reality of life. If you cling to the idea of permanent relationships, you will only set yourself up for disappointment. The key is not to reject relationships or to stop loving others. The key is to accept that all things, including relationships, are temporary. When you stop expecting permanence, you stop suffering when people change or leave." The young seeker took a deep breath, processing what he had just heard. He had always associated love with attachment, believing that to love someone meant to hold on to them, to expect them to remain in his life forever. But now, he was beginning to see that love and attachment were not the same thing. The man continued, "There is a great difference between love and attachment. Love is free, unconditional, and non-dependent. It does not demand anything in return. When you love freely, you give without expectation, and you accept the other person as they are, without trying to change them or hold on to them. Attachment, on the other hand, is based on desire and expectation. It is born from the need to possess or control, and it comes from a place of insecurity." The seeker nodded slowly, understanding now what the man was saying. "So, love without attachment is the way to true peace?" he asked. "Yes," the man answered. "When you love without attachment, you are free. You can experience the joy of connection without the fear of loss. You can enjoy the presence of others without needing them to stay forever. Love becomes a source of peace rather than a source of suffering. Attachment, on the other hand, binds you to the idea that things should never change. But change is the only constant in life. When you release attachment, you open yourself to the beauty of the present moment and the impermanence of all things." The seeker sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the wisdom the man had shared. He had always thought that love meant holding on to people, that loyalty and constancy were the hallmarks of true friendship. But now, he understood that love could be experienced in a more fluid, less possessive way. When you loved without expectation, you were free to embrace the connections you had without fear of their eventual end. The man smiled and placed a hand on the seeker's shoulder. True peace comes from within, from the understanding that nothing lasts forever. People, like all things, are temporary. But love, when it is free and not bound by attachment, transcends time. It is a source of peace, a source of joy, no matter how long it lasts. The seeker nodded, his heart filled with gratitude for the wisdom he had received. He now understood that true friendship and true love were not about possession or permanence, but about acceptance and freedom. The lesson the man had shared with him would stay with him for the rest of his life, guiding him on his journey of self-discovery and understanding. Part 7. The Path to Freedom. The seeker, having listened intently to the man's teachings, was deeply moved by the wisdom he had received. For the first time, he understood that true freedom did not come from avoiding relationships or isolating oneself from others. Rather, it came from seeing through the illusion of attachment, the belief that relationships, people, or situations can be permanent fixtures in our lives. The man had revealed a powerful truth. Relationships, by their very nature, are temporary. And it is when we expect them to be constant, when we cling to the idea that they should remain unchanging, that we suffer. The seeker had spent much of his life fearing abandonment and loss, holding on tightly to relationships in an attempt to prevent the inevitable changes that life brings. He believed that if he could just find the right people or build the perfect friendships, he would be secure, never facing the pain of separation or betrayal. But now, after hearing the man's words, he realized that this approach had only caused him to suffer. The fear of losing people had kept him in a constant state of anxiety, and the attachments he had formed, while deeply meaningful, had created expectations that were destined to be unmet. Instead of living in fear, the man had shown the seeker a new way to live, one that embraced the impermanence of relationships. The path to freedom lay not in rejecting others, but in acknowledging that all relationships, like everything in life, are fleeting. This understanding allowed the seeker to release his attachments and free himself from the anxiety of loss. He didn't need to isolate himself to avoid pain. He simply needed to change his approach to the way he viewed relationships. The greatest lesson the man imparted was simple yet profound. The only true friend you will ever have is yourself. This statement resonated deeply with the seeker. He had long looked to others for validation, for love, and for happiness, but now he understood that relying on external sources for his peace was futile. People come and go, friendships evolve or fade, but the one constant in his life was his own awareness, his own peace, and his own wisdom. When you rely on yourself, no betrayal can break you, no loss can shatter your inner peace. The man had learned to cultivate a sense of self-sufficiency, not out of bitterness or rejection of others, but out of a deep understanding that true happiness comes from within. He no longer depended on others to complete him or to make him feel whole. Instead, he nurtured his own inner strength and peace, knowing that this was the only foundation that would not crumble when external circumstances changed. To make this lesson actionable, the man shared a few practical ways of applying this wisdom in everyday life. First and foremost, he emphasized the importance of mindfulness. Mindfulness allowed the seeker to become aware of his thoughts, emotions, and attachments, and to observe them without getting caught up in them. By practicing mindfulness, the seeker could begin to see relationships and situations for what they truly were, temporary and ever-changing. This awareness freed him from the grip of anxiety and attachment and allowed him to engage in relationships more freely, without the burden of expectations. For example, the man explained that when a friend called in distress, the seeker could offer his support without expecting anything in return. Instead of seeing the friend's need as an obligation, the seeker could recognize it as an opportunity to practice kindness. However, if the friend's situation changed and they no longer needed his support, the seeker could let go without feeling abandoned or rejected. By understanding that his friend's needs were temporary, the seeker could offer help without the fear of losing the connection. In this way, he would be free to love and care for others without the attachment that often causes suffering when things change. Another example the man gave was in dealing with disappointment or betrayal. The seeker had experienced a time when a close friend had let him down, and it had deeply affected him. The man taught him that while it's natural to feel hurt, it's essential to remember that the friendship was based on needs, and those needs had shifted. This wasn't a reflection of his own worth or a sign that all relationships were destined to fail. It was simply a part of the impermanent nature of life. The seeker learned that he could grieve the loss without allowing it to define him. Instead of clinging to the past, he could move forward, knowing that new connections would come into his life, and that those, too, would be temporary. By practicing these principles of mindfulness, detachment, and self-reliance, the seeker found that he was able to navigate his relationships with a greater sense of peace. He didn't live in fear of loss or betrayal anymore. He no longer relied on others for his happiness or security. Instead, he lived with the understanding that all things, people, relationships, even his own emotions, were temporary. This knowledge didn't make him distant or cold. It made him compassionate, kind, and open, but also free from the need for permanence. In embracing this truth, the seeker discovered that freedom was not about isolating himself from others. It was about understanding that relationships, though beautiful and meaningful, are not permanent fixtures. True peace comes from within, and by relying on his own inner strength and wisdom, the seeker was free to love, connect, and experience life without being bound by the fear of loss. Part 8. The Lesson of Detachment. The wisdom the man gained did not lead him to isolate himself from the world. Instead, it taught him how to engage with others in a way that was free from attachment. He began to understand that detachment was not about withdrawal, but about living with awareness and clarity. He could interact with people, care for them, and even love them deeply, but without the expectation that they would remain in his life forever or that they would fulfill his emotional needs. This shift allowed him to engage in relationships with a sense of freedom and inner peace. Detachment, as the man discovered, is not about creating distance or closing oneself off from others. Rather, it's about removing the emotional entanglement that often arises from excessive attachment. When we form relationships with the expectation of permanence or return, we set ourselves up for disappointment. Relationships change, people evolve, and life itself is constantly in flux. When you understand this, you can still offer kindness, love, and care to others without attaching your sense of self or happiness to their actions or responses. The man learned to give kindness without expectation, He would listen to his friends' problems, offer help, and show love, but without expecting anything in return. This did not make him cold or indifferent. Rather, it made him more genuine and compassionate. He no longer gave out of a need for reciprocation, but out of a desire to share goodness and support others on their own journey. In doing so, he found a sense of peace that could not be disturbed by the changing tides of human relationships. He could love freely, without the burden of attachment, and this brought him a profound inner calm. Living without attachment in relationships gave the man a deep sense of freedom. When you stop depending on others for your happiness, you break free from the emotional roller coaster of expectations and disappointments. You no longer seek validation or security from external sources. Instead, you rely on your own inner strength to remain balanced and at peace. This freedom from dependence on others for your emotional well-being means that you can move through life without the fear of betrayal, rejection, or abandonment. You understand that people will come and go, but your peace does not depend on their presence. The man's newfound understanding of detachment allowed him to maintain his inner peace even when relationships evolved or ended. He understood that no matter what happened in the external world, he remained whole. His happiness was not tied to anyone else's actions or feelings. This realization was liberating. He no longer feared the inevitable changes that came with time. He could appreciate people for who they were in the present moment, knowing that their presence in his life was temporary and ever-changing. The absence of attachment freed him from the anxiety of wondering whether a friendship would last or if someone would eventually let him down. One of the key elements in the man's transformation was the understanding of how care and detachment can coexist. Many people associate love and care with attachment, thinking that if they truly love someone, they must cling to them. But the man learned that genuine care does not require clinging. Love can be given freely, without demands or expectations. When you care for someone without the need for them to stay in your life forever, you are not trying to control them or bind them to you. Instead, you are simply allowing them to be who they are, without needing them to fulfill your emotional needs. This type of love is not possessive. It is selfless and compassionate. When you love without attachment, you create space for both your own growth and the growth of others. You allow people to come into your life and leave when their path takes them elsewhere. And in doing so, you free yourself from the pain that comes with trying to hold on to something that is meant to change. Detachment does not mean indifference or apathy. It means you recognize that love and care should be freely given, without strings attached. You can give your energy and heart to someone, but you do not expect them to remain or to provide you with validation in return. The practice of detachment ultimately brings a profound sense of peace. It is the peace that comes from within, not dependent on the actions of others or the stability of relationships. When you let go of attachment, you stop using other people's presence or approval as the measure of your happiness. You become more resilient, able to weather the storms of life with grace and composure. You are no longer tied to the outcomes of your relationships, but instead, you engage in them from a place of abundance and freedom. Through this understanding, the man was able to find deep contentment and peace. He loved without clinging, gave without expecting, and interacted with others without being emotionally bound to them. This way of living allowed him to experience the fullness of human connection while maintaining his own sense of self and inner balance. The lesson of detachment had set him free, and he was no longer afraid of the inevitable changes that life and relationships brought. He understood that, ultimately, the only constant in life was the peace he cultivated within himself. As we reflect on the lessons shared in today's video, it becomes clear that the path to true freedom lies not in avoiding relationships or pushing others away, but in understanding the impermanence of all things. Life, with all its ups and downs, is a journey of constant change, and the relationships we form along the way are no different. The wisdom we've explored teaches us to love without attachment, to give without expectation, and to appreciate the people in our lives for who they are in the present moment, rather than clinging to the idea of permanence. By letting go of the need for others to provide us with happiness or security, we free ourselves from the chains of expectation and the pain of disappointment. The world around us will continue to shift, and people will come and go, but when we stop seeking happiness from external sources, we start to cultivate a peace that can withstand any storm. True freedom comes from within, and it begins when we learn to live with awareness and acceptance of the temporary nature of life and relationships. As you move forward on your own journey, I encourage you to practice these principles in your everyday life. Embrace the impermanence of all things. Let go of attachment and learn to love freely. Appreciate the moments, the people, and the experiences you encounter without holding onto them too tightly. In doing so, you'll find a peace that transcends the fleeting nature of external circumstances. You'll discover that the true source of happiness and freedom has always been within you. Remember, the only true friend you will ever have is yourself. By cultivating your own inner peace, wisdom, and self-reliance, you will no longer be shaken by the inevitable changes in your relationships and the world around you. This is the path of Zen, living with clarity, freedom, and peace in the present moment. Thank you for joining me on this journey of self-discovery. If you found value in today's video, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Mind Journey, where we'll continue to explore the wisdom of Zen and how to live a more mindful, peaceful life. Be sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how these teachings have impacted you and how you plan to incorporate them into your life. Your support helps build our community, and together, we can walk the path of freedom and inner peace. May you find peace, wisdom, and the courage to embrace the impermanence of life as you move forward on your journey.